In our current political environment, the increasing trendiness of jingoistic, nationalist rhetoric has been hard to miss. With the rise of right-wing populist movements in the Caucasus, Europe, and most recently the United States, it's safe to say that the world is experiencing a radical shift in how we perceive not only social and economic issues, but also our own national identities. It's become more and more commonplace for idealistic visions of our past and future to define our political motives, with sometimes borderline fantastical mythologies of national history becoming the basis of political slogans and war campaigns alike. With self-aggrandizing notions of our national identities rapidly becoming the new norm, it's refreshing to see media which refuses to put on these mythological masks and instead takes a sincere, introspective look at nationality, revealing its malleability and dynamism. Kash happens to be one such rare and coveted piece of media. This 2022 Kazakh horror film manages to convey the tragic history of Kazakhs and Kazakh nationality as it came to exist under the Soviet Union in a morbidly engaging, yet dignified and nuanced manner. Before I get any further, this review obviously contains spoilers, so I highly advise you to go and watch the film for yourself before you get any further into this video. It's very accessible to English-speaking audiences, as it can, at the time of recording, be streamed for free online through Tubi with what are, in my opinion, very decent subtitles. And unless you speak both Russian and Kazakh, you sure as hell are gonna need them. Although I'd also argue that much of the movie can be understood even if you don't understand any of the dialogue. So without any further ado, here is Kash. Before the film begins, we are greeted with a title card which reveals the tragic death toll of the Kazakh famine. The very first scene sees a biplane fly overhead as a horse-drawn wagon rolls through the steppe beneath, contrasting the impressive image of the Soviets' rapid technological progress and ambition with the stark reality of life on the periphery. As the camera pans, we see what the wagon is carrying, several new corpses for the mass grave laying before our protagonist, grounding us in the dark and dreadful time period of Stalin's Great Terror, both literally and figuratively. It's 1931 in eastern Kazakhstan, and the cinematography doesn't hold itself back from conveying the cliché but accurately depressing mood of our setting. Passing shots of scenery show little more than sheer desolation, and the film uses a yellowish-gray filter and generally muted colors to hammer that point across. Our protagonist, whose name we later learn is Isatai, drives his wagon through a village of desperate people and charred yurts, which the poor guy calls home. After reporting the dead to the local leadership, it's clear that the situation is bad and only getting worse. Children are starting to die, and everybody who's been sent out to get help hasn't returned or been heard from since. Isatai, knowing the way to the city, ends up being chosen as the next victim for this clearly dangerous journey. Back home in his yurt, Isatai has a chest, and in that chest, there's a kid, Alim, Isatai's brother. Why he keeps the boy in a chest beats me. Everyone in the town seems to know about the kid anyways, but whatever, it's for safety, I guess. I'm just glad that I'm not the one who's gonna have to deal with that drama later. Anyways, after some sentimental character development and exposition, topped with a healthy garnish of the creepy scaries, our heroes start off on their journey, and the film's plot truly begins. The brothers are joined by a Russian soldier who serves as the unsubtle representation of Soviet power, and fittingly, he ditches the two on the very first night. At least he left them a souvenir. As a companion, he is replaced by a mysterious and creepy old man who calls himself by a peculiar name, Tepe. Despite being blind in one eye, Tepe serves as a guide for the two brothers, helping them find their way to Samarkand. However, while seemingly helpful at first, Tepe slowly transforms into the film's main antagonist as he feeds Isatai with depraved thoughts of murder and cannibalism, eventually stalking the two brothers after they attempt to ditch him. While the journey by itself is atmospheric and profound all on its own, the real meat of the film, in my opinion, comes at the very end. Rather than releasing the tension by letting our protagonists die heroically in the steppe and allowing the audience to finally shed their bottled-up tears, or even more predictably having Isatai give in to his hungry temptation, we are given the pleasant satisfaction of seeing the two brothers reach Samarkand intact. only to have that satisfaction instantly taken away by the most tear-jerking box of letters known to man. While the scene could have easily been the final cut to black, instead we're teased with another, equally powerful ending. We cut to a classroom of shaven Kazakh boys and a European-looking woman, their teacher, introducing them to the new Kazakh alphabet. The twist? Well, it's Russian. Kazakhstan is the largest and most sparsely populated of the 5 former Soviet Central Asian republics. The film accurately captures the barren expanse of steppe which makes up most of the Kazakh landscape, as well as the fluctuating climate which, much like a desert, sees the extremes of heat and cold daily as well as seasonally. Also, like a desert or ocean, the steppe can be a disorienting landscape for the unseasoned traveler. Being mostly flat and fairly consistent, it is a biome which can skew one's sense of distance and direction. Most landmarks used to aid in navigation, therefore, tend to be man-made. So I like that the film includes Turkic memorial stones called balbals as both a navigational tool for the protagonists and a mystically mysterious cultural relic for the audience to ponder the symbolic significance of. Even outside of their use as a plot device, the balbals in the film exude an ominous and creepy energy, which is thematic for a horror film. The film accurately portrays language politics. Since the language of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union was Russian, all official discourse in the film is spoken and written in Russian, while informal interactions, which make up the bulk of the film's runtime, are conducted in the local vernacular, that is, in this case, Kazakh. Before the Soviets imposed the Cyrillic alphabet on Kazakhstan and Central Asia at large, Kazakh nomads used a modified Arabic script. Then, in the 1920s, the Latin alphabet was briefly adopted. It was only in the 1930s under Stalin that the Cyrillic alphabet became the new standard, which is why the final scene is so thought-provoking. It really shows how dynamic Kazakh national identity was during this period, and really puts into perspective the scale of the changes instituted by the Soviets. No rock was left unturned. Not one aspect of life was left undisturbed. Just as the local nomadic lifestyle was violently replaced by sedentism, everything down to the language faced a massive overhaul. One detail I like in particular is how the film does not completely exclude ethnic Kazakhs from places of authority. While the film definitely shows the predominance of ethnic Russians in seats of power, the film does not overtly paint them as perpetrators. It instead portrays Russians equally as victims, while nodding subtly, but undeniably, at the active role they play in the system responsible for their own suffering. At certain points in the film, Russians are even portrayed as kind of sympathetic. Even so, the film doesn't shy away from dropping the bombshell that is the final scene, which is anything but subtle in its messaging. While today Russians make up a relatively small minority within the country, at just under 15% of the population, during Soviet times, the situation was very different. The famines of the 1920s and 30s had a profound effect on Kazakhstan's demographics and resulted in the death of up to 40% of the republic's native ethnic population. That's a loss of over 1 million Kazakhs in a span of a decade, a number made all the more gut-wrenching by the fact that Kazakhstan only had a population of 3.6 million to begin with in 1926. After hemorrhaging throughout the 20s and early 30s, Kazakhstan's population would eventually stabilize and begin growing again, but not just through natural reproduction. Between the 1930s and 50s, large numbers of Russians began resettling the steppe, bringing sedentary civilization to this historically nomadic and therefore backwards wasteland. Russian peasants had previously constituted a sizable minority within Kazakhstan during imperial times, but this was a massive escalation in Russian settlement. Additionally, and ironically, Stalin's internment of undesirables in labor camps, gulags, throughout Kazakhstan ended up turning it into one of the most ethnically diverse places in Central Asia. One could find few other places where Russians, Turks, Greeks, and Germans could all live together under a single, albeit dreadful, banner. All jokes aside, Whereas at the start of the century, Kazakhstan had initially been composed primarily of Kazakhs, by the 1960s, Kazakhs had become a minority in their own country, barely brushing past 30% of the general population. Meanwhile, Russians came to significantly outnumber Kazakhs at just over 42% of the population. I mean, just think about that for a moment. A country's indigenous population went from being the indisputable majority to a mere minority in just 2 or 3 decades tops. Although Kazakhstan is not the only country which has had its native population displaced by foreign settlers, what makes it so morbidly fascinating is how recently these changes took place. All in all, it's been less than a century since these events were set in motion. It would take until the 1970s for the Kazakh population to finally start outpacing the growth of ethnic Russians, and the collapse of the Soviet Union would see an exodus of Russians from Kazakhstan back to Russia, which more or less brings us back to today. In my opinion, Kash takes a very cordial approach to the issue of Kazakhstan's historic Russification and wisely chooses not to openly antagonize its Russian characters. Not only does this make the film more palatable to a Russian audience, but it gives it an air of nuance, making it difficult to dismiss as nationalistic propaganda. Rather than portraying the famine as an intentional act of cultural or ethnic genocide, the film focuses instead on the logistical incompetence of the Soviet authorities. It captures how utterly uninformed and unprepared Stalin's regime was in dealing with the Soviet Union's many diverse cultures and localities. While presenting the viewer with the facts, it leaves the interpretation up to us. It does not push a narrative or claim any sort of intention behind the tragedy which took place in Central Asia, as well as all around the Soviet Union during this time. Even so, the film does not shy away from the discomforting reality and the ways in which the Soviets clearly took advantage of the famine's consequences, using it as a means to replace the old, conservative, and nomadic population with the much more malleable, easy to indoctrinate youth. Despite every opportunity to do so, Kash is careful not to pin the blame on its Russian contingents while covering its Kazakh characters in a shroud of victimhood. And thanks to this effort, the film's characters feel more real and full of depth. They feel human. All in all, I'd give the film a solid A for its tactful approach to identity politics. While the characters in the film feel authentic and realistic for the most part, there is one particular outlier, and that is the half-blind old man who wishes to be called Tepe. Tepe is a shared Turkic word which refers to burial mounds, the kind archaeologists love to dig up. But why does this mysterious old man call himself so? Surely there is some symbolism here. My personal theory is that Tepe is simply an allusion to the natural landscape of the Kazakh steppe. It's hilly and yet, paradoxically, flat, smooth as a toddler's bum-bum. So, following this logic, Tepe himself is a personification of the steppe. Meditate on steppe. It even has Tepe in the word itself. Either way, in terms of plot, Tepe serves first as a guide and later as the primary antagonist. In an interview, the film's director, Aysultan Seyitov, presents Tepe simply as a symbol for hunger. In this way, Tepe can be read as Isatai's double, manifesting his inner struggle against the depraved temptations of eating his little brother. Several scenes clearly show how Tepe essentially serves as Isatai's inner monologue, including one where Isatai is clearly hallucinating a table of deliciously prepared food. That scene is resolved with Alim stabbing Tepe in his only good eye, rendering him blind and submissive to the will of the two brothers, no longer able to bother them with his urges. In another scene, where Tepe is trailing the two brothers and gets into a fight with Isatai, Alim runs away from the both of them, suggesting he fears them equally, perhaps because they are one and the same. However, there's also a scene where a dreaming Isatai sees a double of himself, which slightly contradicts the idea that Tepe too can fit that role. But the question of whether or not Tepe is diegetically real or imagined misses the point. The tangibility of his existence is intentionally obscured, just as is the notion of his benevolence. As the film progresses, the viewer comes to question whether or not Tepe is helping or harming the two brothers. Much like the steppe, Tepe is neither good nor bad. Like any other biome, he supersedes value judgments. He simply is. Ultimately, though, regardless of whether or not he is real or a figment of Isatai's increasingly starved mind, Tepe serves as a means through which to confront the audience with the gruesome depravity induced by starvation. By offering him the opportunity to feast on his little brother, Tepe only reinforces Isatai's natural survival instincts to eat or die. Luckily for us, the audience, Isatai is able to avoid the decision entirely, as he and his brother finally arrive at their destination, the town of Sarkand. I can't end this review without discussing the final scenes of the film, both the one with the tear-jerking box of letters from all the distressed and dying corners of Kazakhstan, and its immediate follow-up, the one with Kazakh students being introduced to their country's new alphabet. These two scenes combine to convey a devastating image of death and rebirth, only whereas rebirth typically has an optimistic connotation, in the context of Kash, the country's rebirth via its younger generation can be interpreted to be just as tragic as the previously alluded to death. The new Kazakh alphabet offers a fresh new start, yes, but that start is one which strays away from the country's history and heritage. The idea of a unique and independent Kazakhstan is sacrificed for the sake of Soviet homogeneity. And, well, we all know how that ended up affecting Kazakhstan decades down the line. From the very first dialogues of the film, Kash emphasizes the importance of language as a proxy for power. All official matters are conducted and processed in the language of the Communist Party, yet Kazakhs still manage to assert their agency and independence by using the vernacular. By the end of the film, however, the viewer is made well aware of the fact that soon this would no longer be the case. Kazakh culture, down to its language, would soon be watered down through Russification. Kazakh identity would therefore be forced to play second fiddle to Soviet identity, and every passing generation would become less and less immersed in their ancestral kinship and heritage. Fast forward to today, and with the Soviet Union gone for the last 3 or 4 decades, Kazakhstan is now, for the first time in its history, a completely independent state. Its population demographics have mostly recovered since the 60s and 70s, and now ethnic Kazakhs once more make up a popular majority. And whereas Kash depicts a rapidly changing landscape thanks to the novel force that was then Soviet power has since become an element of history, a dying culture which once dominated the lifestyles of those generations which still remember it firsthand. Although the collapse of the Soviet Union was far less traumatic and deadly than was the Bolshevik Revolution, it can be argued that this relatively recent event was just as consequential for Kazakh national identity. But only time will tell how future Kazakh filmmakers will choose to capture and remember the last few decades of their country's history. So that's Kash. In the end, Kash is more than just a horror film set during one of Kazakhstan's darkest chapters. It's a meditation on how nations are shaped, broken, and reassembled, not through myth or propaganda, but through lived human struggle. By refusing to lean on simple villains or heroic archetypes, the film grants its characters, and by extension Kazakhstan itself, a dignity that resists both romanticization and victimhood. In doing so, it reminds us that national identity is not a static relic of the past, but something constantly rewritten through memory, language, and survival. Kash is a story that lingers, grim, unsettling, and profoundly human. And in a world where nationalism is too often painted in broad, triumphant strokes, it dares to offer something far rarer: honesty.